As a horror enthusiast, I get asked a lot of questions, mainly from my mother, but, who cares? The question I get asked most often is, what was the best year of horror? Really, the question you should be asking yourself is, what was the best decade of horror? And that's easy. That would be the 1980s. The 1980s thrived on low-budget horror movies, from low-budget slashers to low-budget monster movies. Horror started in 1896, with the first movie ever being called The House of the Devil. Of course, it was a foreign film, not American. Horror movies you might know. From the 80s, you have classic pictures, or not so well-known pictures. The Critters franchise. And we got The Evil Dead, My Bloody Valentine, The Burning, Psycho 2, Sleepaway Camp, Slumber Party Massacre, The Thing, and of course cult classic franchises Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. A lot of you may not know this, but in the 80s, horror movies gained a lot of cult classics that are still known today. I mean, you have Stephen King's Cujo, you have Stephen King's The Shining, you have The Fog, Hellraiser, Christine, Cannibal Holocaust, Day of the Dead. I mean, all these fun movies that are still relevant today. What about horror was so engaging in the 80s? Mostly just the blood, gore, scares. Honestly, every single 80s horror movie that I've ever seen is very campy, very stupid, but it's a lot of fun. Mainly, horror in the 80s was very much influenced by horror in the 70s. Horror in the 70s, you had movies like Black Christmas and Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre to really influence the horror movies of the 80s. Horror has a lot of subgenres. Of course, a subgenre is a direct thing that's not complete horror, but it has a little twist on it. Of course, in the 80s, the most common one in the 80s was, of course, slasher horrors, which are personally my favorite kind of horrors. You also have suspense, comedy horrors, sci-fi, fantasy, psychological thrillers, cult films, which, paranormal. Come on. A lot of other movies you have Creepshow, Firestarter, Silver Bullet, Christine, Maximum Overdrive, Monster Squad, Motel Hell, House, The Lost Boys, Children of the Corn, Prom Night, and a lot of Halloween sequels. Same thing with Friday the 13th. A lot of sequels. A lot of horror movies in the 80s really influenced horror movies still to this day. And a lot of them are still really, really relevant. Friday the 13th, that started back in 1980, and it's still very much talked about today. Halloween, even though it was made in the late 70s, it influenced a lot. And I mean a lot of horror movies. Literally, Friday the 13th is literally a Halloween ripoff. Come on. But a lot of movies are still relevant today and still looked at today as cult classics, and they really help movies that are being made today. Horror, or whether it be comedies or children's films, really. Come on. Horror in the 80s were fantastic. They're still fantastic, even though they're really fucking cheap. They're cool. 80s horror movies are definitely important nowadays. They're still talked about today, and really, that's really the only good decade of horror movies. You can say oh no, the 70s were great, 90s are pretty good, 2000s are great. No, they're really not. They're really not. 2000 and onwards horror movies, fuck no. I'm kidding. I like some of those, but 80s is where it really thrived, and I'm glad that I watched them all. if you really want to know more about 80s horror movies and how they were made and what went into them, I recommend checking out this 3-part documentary called In Search of Darkness. Really informative. I love it. Check that out. Overall, horror movies in the 80s are very, very, very influential. I mean, I love them. I still pull ideas from them while I'm writing. They're a good help, and they're very much iconic.